a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, Memoir Nation listeners. If you haven't heard, we are hosting monthly classes at Memoir Nation featuring memoir writers and teachers who are experts in the genre and the craft. And we want to make sure you know about our next two courses because we have some really amazing memoirists who are teaching them. Maggie Smith is coming up in October, and Carvel Wallace is coming up in November. So, Brooke, I think these were two of our favorite books of the past couple of years, and now it's just so amazing that they're teaching for us.
Yeah, that's right. Maggie Smith is the author of You Could Make This Place Beautiful, and Carvel Wallace wrote Another Word for Love. And Maggie will be teaching about experimenting with form, which she did so beautifully in her own memoir. And Carvel is teaching about theme, also incredibly executed in his book. So you are in for a treat. These classes are just $49. And honestly, these are some of the most talented writers of our era. I do not even say that lightly. And they have so many wonderful insights. So we are inviting you to come check it out. Come join us. Mark your calendars, October 14th for Maggie Smith and November 4th for Carvel Wallace. Really, truly, these classes are going to be worth every penny.
Absolutely. So check out the details at memoirnation.com under the classes tab and explore what we're up to while you're there. You know, we're growing Memoir Nation each and every week. So if you're looking for community and writing advice and great classes and much more, come see what we're up to. And we hope to see you on October 14 or November 4, or for both, or for the classes after that as well.
Totally. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. Visit memoirnation.com. And now on to today's show. Hello, commercial writers, literary writers, and legacy writers. I'm Brooke Warner, and I am here with Grant Faulkner. And Grant, I am happy today because our guest, Regina Brooks, is a good friend of mine and someone I love to talk memoir with. She's an agent, but she's also an entrepreneur, an author advocate, a forward thinker, an author herself, and a person who's super involved in the literary world. And she happens also to be on our advisory committee for Memoir Nation, too. So that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, me too. And Regina represents and sells memoirs, and I always love her take on memoir because she's an agent and she's necessarily always prodding and pushing memoirs in ways to make them more saleable. And so, Grant, I thought we'd use our conversation time today to talk a bit about this continuum of saleability, which is incredibly subjective, first of all, but it's also a space where what the industry wants can and sometimes does clash with what writers want to write or publish. And so I'd love to hear your take on this idea of a continuum, in terms of like writing commercially being on one side and writing for passion being on the other.
It's really the eternal question, I think, for writers. You know, we're all kind of living it and deciding where we are on that continuum. So I just love this topic. And I also like it when we pull back the curtain a bit, because I think sometimes writers, and this is the way I was when I first started out, you know, I thought that editors are sort of all a part of a tribunal of something, and they're making these objective decisions, like the Supreme Court making these objective decisions on what has the most literary merit, and then, you know, publishing a book based on that. But editors are also part of a business, and a business that needs to make money like any other business. So while they might be interested in high literary work, you know, generally, even with a small press's degree, there's this question of will the book sell? And I always say it's just so tough to sell a copy of a book, you know, tougher than I ever realized before I started out, because you're literally competing with millions of other books, and people have limited time and money or even space in their house. But that said, every time I'm asked that question, I just believe in writing what you're passionate about. And I think in the end, that is your paycheck for being a writer. That is what will give you satisfaction and solace. And also, saleability is just so difficult to determine, you know, and it depends on so many variables. So, you know, like I always tell people, don't write a vampire novel just because vampire novels are trendy. You know, I think you're more likely to write a bestseller if it comes from your heart, not your head.
So true. And, this is kind of a timely topic as we're thinking about interviewing Regina this week, because Allison K. Williams wrote something on the Brevity blog last week where she was making the point that in order to sell a memoir, you have to make it about the reader. And of course, in that context, she's talking about saleability and this conversation of memoir as a business. And savvy writers understand that, of course, but even still, it's not an easy thing to serve up when you're writing memoir. The story is about you and it's about your life. And Regina and I originally know each other from my days at Seal Press, and she and I have had many conversations over the years. We're on the writer conference circuit together a lot. And she talks about her orientation towards saleability, because you have to have that orientation when you're an agent. And so I've seen her make the case in years past, and especially since this idea of Memoir Plus has kind of come more on the radar of a lot of people. But Memoir Plus is really just prescriptive memoir or memoir with takeaway, which has been a thing for forever. Back when I was acquiring memoirs for Seal, we were thinking about that stuff too. We just didn't call it Memoir Plus. But when authors do that, they're doing what it takes and kind of mining deep to make their books more attractive to a broader readership. But I do appreciate that Regina always has her eye on that, because as an agent, you kind of have to be scrappy. It's what the job requires. And so it makes you kind of like look at memoirs and want to finesse them and change them. But some writers, as we're talking about, they don't want to shape their book to what the market wants or demands. And so this concept that we're talking about, like writing the book you want to write, is part of this continuum as well, because there is some appeal knowing that if you want to publish the book that you want to write, there are hybrid and self-publishing options. And if you understand that you're going to be shaped a little bit more, then you might be, like leaning toward the commercial aspect of this, or really looking for an agent. And so in Allison's piece, I just wanted to bring this up. She writes, yes, you must have a powerful story to tell, but by choosing our audience and taking the time to speak directly to them and listen in return, we can chart our own publishing course. For traditional publishing, we can present our recognition within our niche. For hybrid or self-publishing, we'll know exactly who will want to buy our book. And for the process of our writing, we'll be able to share ourselves honestly on the page, because we're talking to the readers who trust us, need us, and know us. So I just really liked that, because it's very inclusive in its approach. And she's telling people, think about your audience, but think about the publishing path too. And all of this is really, falls under the mosaic of understanding what your book is and who potentially it can reach.
So interesting, Brooke, because it's true, and maybe not spoken enough, that there is this continuum of saleability or marketability that you mentioned, and also that writers publish for very different reasons and motivations. And there are writers who publish legacy memoirs because they want to leave something for their family and friends, and there are writers who have very particular sensibilities, so they might want to do something more specific that might not, lend itself to such a commercial audience. And then there are writers who only want to be as commercial as possible. But I'm not sure that new writers who come to the page to write what they love necessarily realize, at least at first, that this continuum exists, or just how much nuance there is in the world of publishing, or maybe just how many variations or experiences or directions there are when it comes to this question of how to publish, which is a conversation about the business of memoir, really.
Yeah, it so much is. And in my experience, writers don't often understand these variations or don't understand them well enough. I mean, of course, they understand that there are different paths to publishing and different ways of conceiving of your memoir, but I'm not sure that most writers understand, that there are these commercial memoirs versus literary memoirs versus legacy memoirs and stuff in between, of course. And then in addition to that, what distinguishes those? Yeah,
completely agree. And, I've been doing this now for 40 years. And so sometimes when I think back to when I first started out, I forget how much knowledge I've actually picked up over those years, even though I still have a lot to learn. But I was wondering, for reasons of education for our listeners who are newish writers, do you want to take a crack at defining those categories?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, we can start with commercial. A commercial memoir means you have a strong hook. It could also mean you're famous. But since most of our listeners are not famous, I think we should talk about hook. And in recent years, I'm thinking about a book like Stephanie Foo's What My Bones Know. Her hook, for instance, was very explicit and specific. It was about having complex PTSD and her, working through that diagnosis. And it was meaningful as a hook because while there have been tons of memoir about trauma over the years, hers was the first memoir to tackle complex PTSD, which is actually a fairly new diagnosis in the DSM. And I think editors at houses, big and small, are actually looking for things that have not been done to the extent that that's possible. So what a book is about actually really matters. And it's going to be a lot harder to sell a book that is about what 100 or 1,000 other books are about, which is why it's always interesting and wonderful to me to see a book that actually is about something as mundane as divorce or mental illness or abuse. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, not to say that they're mundane topics per se, but just that these topics have been done to death. And so either you need to do them in a new way, a new angle in, or you have a really unique voice or an interesting structure, or perhaps you're capturing a zeitgeist, which is kind of like what Maggie Smith did in her recent memoir, You Could Make This Place Beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. And that's interesting because I think we could make the case that memoirs like Maggie's that are so popular now, and I'm speaking of memoirs that are, structured in this kind of fragmented collage-like style that have been trendy, maybe they wouldn't have been 10 years ago. And even when I kind of told my agent about my very collage-y memoir, she wasn't sure, she thought it might be a little too artsy to sell.
Yeah, it's interesting. Trends do come and go, obviously, and certain authors capture readers' attention in various ways. But we have been noting that memoir for sure. But I did want to give one more example because, speaking of people who don't really have platforms, Tara Westover is interesting. She's the author of Educated. And I think like what happened with her was that she just captured a moment because she was writing about a segment of the population that happened to be a curiosity to readers, which was basically preppers who don't educate their kids. And, writing about growing up in a fundamentalist Mormon family in rural Idaho that prepared extensively for the end of times piqued people's curiosity. It's like an unusual story. And she was a tremendous writer. And so even though she didn't have a big platform, Educated still broke out because of what it was about. And I just want to note that because there are cases where you'll see books gain a lot of traction and attention. And it really is because the stories or topics themselves are so compelling.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense in terms of what agents and editors are looking for. So I'm going to venture into this dangerous terrain. What about literary memoirs? Can readers hope to break out if they have something more literary? And I have to say, please say yes, Brooke, because that's what I'm writing.
I think what's so hard about literary memoir when it comes to like breaking out is that you kind of already have to be known. I'm thinking about literary writers who have written memoir like Rachel Cusk, Carmen Maria Machado, Jesmyn Ward. Melissa Febos comes to mind too, since we just had her on the show talking about her decidedly literary memoir, The Dry Season. These are writers who are career writers, and they're usually professors or professional writers who are publishing regularly. I kind of feel like they get to do literary memoir and then be known for it because they're masters of the craft. And don't despair, Grant, because this doesn't mean to say that normal people like us can't write literary memoir, that they don't. But the problem with literary is that it does sort of translate into book publishing circles as unsaleable. And so if you're a normal person who wants to do something very literary, it's usually the case that agents and editors are not going to be knocking down your door to represent your book. So that's just the reality.
I think I'm inherently and eternally unsaleable, but I think I pretty much knew that. And I'm just thinking right now, I'm going to get a t-shirt that says unsaleable writer, or literary writer, unsaleable.
I love it. When we open our store, I think that would be a very popular shirt, along with what Regina Brooks said, relatively unknown writer would be another good slogan.
I like that. So let's get to what you called legacy memoir. Where does that fit in?
Legacy memoir is a memoir that people are writing just because they have to, or they really care about their story. They want to get it out in the world. I just talked to someone the other day who wants to self-publish her book about her mother's mental illness and surviving it. She shopped it around to 40 editors, and she understands that it just is not particularly commercial. And instead of being discouraged, she just wants to get it done and she wants to have it out there. And it's okay, not super commercial, but it is very story driven. It's very well written. And these are the kinds of books that I see all the time. They're solid, good books, but they're just not going to get placed with an agent, most likely because the author is not well enough known. There's not space for them at traditional houses, often because of that aforementioned lack of author platform, and sometimes just because the agent or editor is like, we've seen this before. It's a hard kind of feedback for authors to get, but I always feel like it's also kind of a shitty feedback, because you shouldn't not publish your book because someone else has already done something in the same category. Like, your book is unique. It's going to be, unique to your story. It will find its readership, but maybe it can't find the kind of readership, that a traditional house needs in order to justify it. So for me, legacy memoirs speak to books that are, great candidates for hybrid or self-publishing, depending on the author's goals and how widely they want to get the book out into the world. But I know you agree with me, Grant, that we feel like these stories should get out.
Absolutely. And this has been such an interesting overview. So thank you. And in that Allison K. Williams post you mentioned, she references a Substack article that's getting a lot of attention from Alia Habib. And it's an interview with 5 top book editors. And it's just so good. Alia describes what she calls tough categories, which include collections of essays, memoirs, or there are many like subvariants, the memoir and essays, the lyric essay, the braided memoir, the family memoir, the memoir plus. Basically, all my favorite genres are tough categories. So,
totally.
Yeah, it may be unsaleable. I hope not. But so one of the questions we're going to pose to Regina is why memoir qualifies as a tough category, and what, if anything, writers can do to improve their chances of selling their memoirs. And also maybe we'll discuss when it's right to be good with what you have and consider other publishing options, basically taking the reins, because traditional publishing is increasingly not for everyone. So we'll be right back with all this and more after this short break. Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently. And that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. All of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree, and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or a beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon, and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too.
Welcome back, everyone. I am so pleased to have my friend Regina Brooks with us on the show today. Regina is the founder and CEO of Serendipity Literary Agency in New York, the largest African-American owned agency in the U.S. She is the president of the Association of American Literary Agents and co-producer of the People of Publishing Conference. Also, she's a founding member of Literary Agents of Change and the Black Book Accelerator. And she's also recently on our advisory committee for Memoir Nation. So thank you for that, Regina. She is the author of Writing Great Books for Young Adults and You Should Really Write a Book, How to Write, Sell, and Market Your Memoir. She's a co-publisher with Open Lens, an imprint of Akashic Books. And she's also been highlighted in the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. When she's not agenting, she is gardening, fishing, or flying her own plane. What? Always in a dress, it says. I love that, Regina. Welcome. You are like a Renaissance woman extraordinaire.
Hello, Brooke. So happy to be here.
I always love seeing you, and I'm so glad to finally have you on the podcast because we have been talking about it forever. And you're one of these agents who actually takes memoir, sells memoir, knows more about memoir than the average agent, I think. And I'm curious if we could start with a baseline question, which is, what makes a memoir saleable? And like, what distinguishes a memoir that sells from one that maybe simply moves people?
Very good question. And a question that I get from authors all the time, especially given the fact that oftentimes people really do have great stories, but they're not always saleable, or I should say commercially viable. And what I mean by commercially viable, meaning that, you know, the big five publishers feel like they're going to be able to get a significant return on their investment. And so when we talk about saleability on a memoir, there are a number of things that I look for. And the reason that I'm looking for them as an agent is because these are the things that publishers are looking for. Obviously, people want the book to be well written. And I'm sure your audience is well aware of the idea of platform. And oftentimes platform today, people think about social media as a way of identifying that to an editor or an agent that you have a platform. But I oftentimes tell authors not to just think about social media, because it's really, especially with memoir, it's about getting butts in seats. And because you can be an executive, and if you're an executive writing a memoir and telling your story, you might not be spending a lot of time on social media, but your network is extraordinary. And you can get into a number of rooms where people would buy the book. You know, you can get corporate buys. So when I think about saleability of a book, I think about the quality of the writing. I think about having a platform. And I also think about the idea of having a hook. And what is a hook?
Well, that's actually a great question, because Grant and I talked about this in the banter earlier. Like the hook, I think people maybe mistake a hook for what it actually is, because I think the hook is just like, what is the book about? And that people struggle sometimes to articulate that. Do you agree?
Yeah, especially when it comes to telling your own story, because people will say, well, the book's about me.
Right.
I'm the hook.
You're like, no,
I am the hook. Yeah, well, not so much. Not always, you know. So for example, I don't always like to think about memoirs as stories about celebrities or influencers or people of note. Some really incredible people who don't have big platforms and big names have wonderful stories to tell. But when we think about, okay, what's the hook? It's thinking about, okay, what's going to draw someone into your story and feel like that your story is their story, or your story is a story that they're going to want to share with other people. What's that talkability quotient? What is the thing that's going to make me say, oh my gosh, you have got to read this book, to a friend, to a colleague? And it may not just be your name. It's about that essential thing that makes that story unique and makes me want to talk about it. I mean, there are a number of different ways to describe hook, but I often say it's the thing that it's the theme, the content that makes me feel something in my gut and makes me want to share it with others.
That's so interesting, Regina, because I was just about to say, I've been rejected a lot by agents. I have a particular specialty in that. And usually the response is, I just didn't fall in love with this book enough to represent it. And in talking with my current agent, I really get that, how much you have to believe in the book and love the book to put your skin in the game and all that effort that requires, that's behind selling a book. The way you were describing the hook, it made me think that was equivalent to falling in love with the book. So I guess I'm also just curious about how you assess all these different factors, to make a decision and accept something.
Yeah. I mean, when I get that response from editors, because I get that response too, that I didn't fall in love with the book, I'm like, I don't need you to love the book. I need the readers to love the book. Right. But there is something about if I am an editor or an agent for that matter, and I have made the decision that I am going to, work on 10 books, I want to feel a passion for those 10 books because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to invest yourself. And that investment has to be both a cerebral investment and a heart investment. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when they talk about, I didn't fall in love with a book, you want an editor who is in love with your book, or at least a strong like, because that means that they are willing to invest their energy, their essence, oftentimes hearing no internally too. And they have to have a way to meet those objections. And if you can't meet the objections because you are whole body invested, it makes it very difficult to win.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that, would-be authors often don't think about all the work that goes on behind the scenes with agents. And you and I have talked about this, Regina, because you are an agent. I mean, I think many are, but you're pretty hands-on. And sometimes you talk to authors about changing the scope of their memoirs to make them more saleable. And you can be like proactive about this stuff. Like I remember last time I saw you, we were talking about Memoir Plus, and that for some authors to make their books more prescriptive in nature would make them more saleable. And I'm curious, because I think that was like a year ago. I mean, are you still seeing the market that way? And do books come across your desk that you want to shape and change to, try to see if you can sell them to more publishers and get them out the door?
Absolutely. And sometimes, so when I think about Memoir Plus, I'm thinking about the individual telling their story, but also having takeaways for the reader that are very prescriptive in nature. It may be lessons, lessons that the author learned, and also lessons that you want to share with the audience who's reading your book. When we think about prescriptive books, prescriptive nonfiction, we think of recipes, we think of, so it's adding on to telling your story, but also giving the reader some takeaways from your story. And I oftentimes have to do that. And I will tell you that the publishers tend to have a little bit more interest and excitement around Memoir Plus. And then there are some editors and agents who say, yeah, this is just a way to shroud the fact that you want to tell your story. But I do think that oftentimes it's easier to sell it not only to the publishers, but also to an audience when you have Memoir Plus.
Well, Regina, I'm curious. I've heard a few memoirists who I work with express this concern. And the concern is basically like, how can a memoirist who's writing about trauma or their upbringing or their, family or their divorce position, how can they position their story for the market without feeling they're commercializing their pain or their authenticity? How they're writing the truth, but also at the same time, it's becoming a product in a book.
So one of the things that I tell authors, especially when they are writing a story that has numerous elements of trauma, is that they, number one, have to be committed to talking about that trauma for a minimum of 18 months every day. And when I say that to a person, then they oftentimes, I don't know if I'm ready to do that. It's one thing to write it down. It's another thing to have to do interviews, have to be in front of individuals, talking about it, answering questions about it, being triggered oftentimes about the things that you've experienced. So I think the idea of making trauma and the book be a product, tied to it, I think asking that question to a writer, sometimes they say, okay, yeah, maybe I'll just write this and I'll use it as kind of a therapeutic process for myself, but maybe I don't want to necessarily talk about this every day for 18 months. And I have had, and the reason I say 18 months is because it takes a while. First, you have to have the book be discovered. So, you have to put it out there in the world, and then people have to read it. And then you get a chance to talk about it with the people who have read it. And so throughout that entire cycle of you're hearing people say certain things about it. I've had authors who have come to me and said, that was really hard, meaning having conversations about it in media outlets. And I oftentimes also tell authors if they are in therapy, that they should stay in therapy during this process because, you will be triggered and you need to have a way. I mean, I had one author who started crying in an interview, and it kind of helped the sales. But, with authors, you don't want to feel like you're not in control of your emotions around the trauma. And then and I've also had publishers say to me that, we're kind of moving away from this kind of trauma porn. And I hate when they say that, but it's the idea that there's been so much written about trauma that it's starting to get excessive.
Yeah, those are all such interesting points in terms of how the industry thinks about these harder topics. And it's a great segue to my next question, actually, because Aliyah Habib, who's an agent that you and I both know, she recently interviewed some editors at the big five houses, and she posted on Substack and writes about memoir as what she calls a quote unquote tough category. And I was curious if you could share what that means to you, if you agree that memoir is a tough category, and what can writers do to improve their chances of selling memoirs when we do know that the industry does sort of look sideways at memoirs sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, when she says that it's a tough category, there are definitely editors who are looking for memoir. I mean, that's kind of their beat, so to speak. That's what they want. They want memoir. But the bar is super high. And as an agent, oftentimes I will read a proposal and I'm like, oh, gosh, this is a really good book. Who am I going to sell this to? Because going back to some of the things that I was saying before, you have to have this platform that's huge, especially if you're going with the big five. And again, I think when she says it's a tough category, even when the editors are truly invested in the book and they put lots of marketing and promotion behind the book, and the author is fully engaged in marketing the book, sometimes the consumer says, you know what? I need to read something with levity. I'm not interested in reading, this type of a story. Or I hear from consumers, this just happened at a conference probably about 3 months ago. A consumer said to me, you know what? It feels like everybody's writing the same story. Everyone's saying the same thing in their books. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, it feels like if I've read one, I've read them all. And that's another thing that editors feel too. So when they talk about tough, it's like, are you saying something, uniquely different? Of course, there's nothing new under the sun, but how are you expressing and shaping the material in a way that feels fresh? And if I may, I would love to just kind of talk a little bit about what is a fresh approach to writing a story. And Brooke, you and I have talked about this a lot. And I have encouraged authors to not just think about the story in a kind of a chronological linear format. This happened, and then, you're just writing the expository way of getting the book out in the world. And I've had authors who have written their memoirs in verse. I've had people make a decision, oh, you know what? I can do this as a graphic memoir. I've had individuals do their memoirs as children's picture books. So, there's all these different approaches to it. And depending on what the story is, there are ways that you can penetrate the market in fresh ways that won't feel like you're doing a book that someone else has already written to, even though your story is fresh and unique to you. And that kind of goes back to the hook.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Full circle.
Yeah. So is your hook the same hook that 5 other people have written about?
Well, Regina, I'm curious to know or to talk a little bit about memoirs up and down cycles. And I'm mentioning this in the context of this fall, there were 3 really big memoirs that hit and got a lot of attention, although much of it was negative. And those were the memoirs by Molly Jong-Fast and Elizabeth Gilbert and Kamala Harris. And so I was wondering, do you think that big memoirs like these that get a lot of cultural and media attention, make memoir any more or less appealing to editors at publishing houses, or do books like those exist on a separate plane from regular memoir?
I think to some extent they operate on a different plane because of who the individuals are who are writing them. Mm-hmm. And especially Kamala Harris, in terms of, she's a politician. She had a story that people wanted. There were a lot of things that happened that we might not know about. So there was a little bit of intrigue, and people were interested in hearing, oh gosh, what does she have to say? So, and that led before, I think, even her story, people were interested in hearing about things that happen that they weren't necessarily aware of. And so they're hoping that there's going to be something juicy in the book itself. And she has a platform. Molly Jong-Fast is the same thing. These are highly platformed memoirs. And oftentimes the editors go after them versus, them pitching.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I'm sure all of those books went to auction and got massive advances. And it is an interesting thing to think about. Do the editors even see them in the same, mind space as a memoir coming from someone who's unknown? Probably not.
Not at all.
Yeah. Regina, I wanted to ask if there's a solid piece of advice you would give to listeners out there who are memoirists, who don't have that platform that we're talking about. If you really are just a normal person, you maybe have a little bit of a social media presence, maybe you've started a Substack, but you have this book that you're really passionate about. Is there stuff that attracts you to those kinds of people? Is there anything that can move the needle for you these days?
Absolutely. I mean, I call people who don't have these huge platforms, I call them relatively unknowns.
I like it.
And there's a broad area of people who are relatively unknowns. They could be known to their regional area. They can be known to a niche. And that niche of people are interested in buying your book. So just help us understand who the individuals are who are interested in your book. And not every book are publishers looking to sell hundreds of thousands of copies. I know when I was an editor and as an agent, I have what I call a balanced portfolio. And what I mean by that is I'll have, if I'm doing 10 books, there are going to be probably 6 of those books that I'm looking to make, huge sales from. And then I have my passion projects, the projects that I believe need to be published and I'm going to do whatever I can do to get those books out into the world. And sometimes those authors don't come with huge platforms. And I help them kind of carve out, where's your audience? Where are your buyers? Let's prove it to me, and let's prove it to a publisher. And there are publishers out there who are willing to take a chance on a book and an author who may not have a huge platform. So I want to encourage people not to give up, because I really do believe, and I've worked with a lot of them. I work with a number of memoirists where I've had to say, okay, you know what, I know it's going to be hard to sell this, but I'm going to find a publisher who's going to believe in this book and who is going to be passionate about it. And I need you to come with that same level of passion. And I'm going to show you how to do that and get the book sold, not just to the publisher, but also to an audience.
Well, Regina, before we end, I'm sorry to say that two of the things that were most interesting about your bio weren't related to memoir or publishing. It was that you fish and you fly your own plane in a dress. And so I don't think we can end without talking about these two hobbies. So what's the biggest fish you've ever caught, and what's the most exotic destination you've ever flown your plane to?
So first of all, I am a hobbyist when it comes to both fishing and flying. And one of the things that I love to do as it relates to flying is I like to take kids up and get them really excited about aviation and STEM and helping them to believe that they can do whatever they want. So I fly locally and I do little events to take kids up. But I have flown like to Massachusetts. I'm in New York. So I've flown to Massachusetts and to Pennsylvania and very short jaunts. And then in terms of fishing, oh my gosh, I wish I could fish more often. You know, at some point I'm going to retire, and that is exactly what I'm going to do as much as possible, is go fishing. But I usually lake fish. So it's not about, for me, it's not about the size of the fish. It's about the volume and the number of fish that I catch. And, you know, lately I've been more of a catch and release type fisher person, but or angler, I should say. But I have in the past, when I was catching fish, I would like get bags and bags and bags of fish. So.
That's awesome. I can see that. And then you just like load them up into your plane and you're off. Oh, thank you, Regina. You're always so wise and insightful. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you for allowing me to be here and to talk to your audience. I'm very excited. And hopefully maybe one of you who are listening will send me something that I can get excited about.
That's a great invitation. Thank you, Regina.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. Well, dear listeners, this is the book trend section, but we're taking this space to offer a sincere apology for something that was brought to our attention having to do with our ads on this podcast. One of our loyal listeners let us know that a recent episode featured an ad recruiting for ICE. And Grant, obviously we were shocked and upset by this advertisement because we do not promote ICE, nor do we condone ICE's activities or behaviors. And investigating how this happened actually took us down an interesting rabbit hole that was both enlightening and discouraging about how ads get vetted on this platform that we use, which is called Megaphone.
Yeah, Megaphone's now owned by Spotify, just to put it in greater context. And I will say that LitHub, which is our distributor and also hosts this podcast on their LitHub radio channel, they jumped right on this and they escalated the problem with Megaphone, so we appreciate that. And we discovered that when it comes to podcast ads, the advertising party chooses a box. And we had previously unchecked the political ad box because we wanted to have some control over what political ads might filter through. But the ICE ad came through on a box called job opportunities. And we also discovered that there's really no meaningful vetting process when it comes to ads. And it's virtually impossible, given Megaphone's reach and how many podcasts they host, to give hosts like us total vetting power. So we we just have to uncheck more boxes. And we certainly didn't consider that job opportunities was going to give us a recruitment ad for ICE, which was just so horrible to hear and very frustrating work.
Yeah, horrible and alienating to some of our listeners, which is why we're wanting to put out this apology. I mean, myself included. And what's also frustrating about this entire ad situation is that we don't make any money on ads, like $0. So here we are discovering that we're promoting ICE unbeknownst to us, and also not getting a kickback. I mean, not that I would want to promote ICE if we did get a kickback. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I just find the whole thing very troubling, because we have whatever listenership we have that we've built, and then people trust us and they listen to our podcast, and surely they think that we've hit it big time because we have ads in the first place, but that is not the case. And this experience is really prompting us, Grant, to look at our options, because frankly, I'm confused. It does make me wonder how much those ads cost, how widely they're placed, and then what percentage of the money is going where, like speaking to Spotify owning that piece of it. And I have to say that I feel exploited, because when we moved to LitHub, we did make this agreement to have ads, but I think now there's like this lack of transparency. We don't really know whose hands this is all falling into in the first place. And, I have to say, I don't really blame LitHub, but then I'm like, if LitHub isn't getting a kickback either, what in the world is going on here?
I don't know. We got to figure it out. And, on one hand, though, LitHub's interesting as an entity and as a distributor. Jane Friedman, in her newsletter this past week, she featured a little call out that LitHub is actually persisting in its strongly leftward turn, and here's a quote from Alexander Nazarian at ARC. LitHub has taken a determined step into activism, even as many other outlets stung by the anti-woke backlash have rethought the commitments they had made in 2020. LitHub has touted those commitments with newfound enthusiasm. And I found this a very timely piece of information in light of our experience with them. And they really did go to bat for us very promptly over this ad.
Yeah, they sure did, and were aligned with us on that issue. And it's an interesting piece by Nazarian because it's primarily talking about LitHub leaning left specific to Palestine. And the Israel-Palestine conversation is so fraught everywhere, but maybe particularly in book publishing because it's so dominated by Jewish people. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but LitHub has actually gotten a lot of pushback for being anti-Semitic in its pursuit of defending Palestine. And like a lot of people, I have spent these past 2 years insisting that I and others be allowed to support Israel and Israel's right to exist, while also asserting that what Netanyahu and the Israeli government is doing is absolutely state-sponsored slaughter and terror. And, for me, Grant, when I look at this stuff that's happening with ICE, it's the same thing. ICE is state-sponsored terrorism right now. And the stuff that we have been seeing in these past weeks is unconscionable. Raiding apartments, zip tying kids, sending border agents to Chicago, troops in American cities, rounding up people for the color of their skin, sorting out whether or not they're even American citizens later, who cares? And there is a direct parallel in my mind to this sort of tolerance of what's been allowed to happen in Palestine for these past 2 years as a permission structure for ICE here. And that is, yet another reason that we need to push back so hard.
Yeah, we do. And we're starting by saying that we do not condone ICE recruitment ads on this podcast. We do not condone state-sponsored violence or the actions of ICE. We do not believe that the National Guard should be in liberal American cities for the purpose of trying to incite violence among the people, it's there to provoke. And we're living in scary times, as I think everybody knows, and we just want to distance ourselves very strongly from anything to do with our work that would associate us with violence, hatred, bias, prejudice, that we even have to have this conversation and apology also speaks to how much we've been infiltrated by forces that feel too big to control. And that said, we're here. We just want to clearly delineate our position and to apologize unequivocally.
Yeah, it's so important to us. So thanks for that, Grant. And thanks to our loyal listener and friend, Mariana, who brought the ad to our attention. It does seem to be in limited markets, perhaps, because I have a couple of other friends who heard that they did not hear the ad. But still, it could pop up again. We don't know, but we're still working to figure that out. So thanks to all of you for your community, friendship, listenership. Writing memoir is something that can and does exist outside of political conversations, and I am grateful for that in my day-to-day. But memoir is also a mirror and a window to our culture in any given moment. And right now we are being shaped by history and by these events and choices and actions that will absolutely determine all of our futures. And this moment that we're living in right now will populate the pages of future memoirs. And we don't get to exist separate from what's happening on the national stage or the global stage as much as we might wish that we could. But boy, are we living through a moment. And that said, we are very happy to know that we're in it with you, that we are prioritizing something that is true and empowering and authentic. And that thing is story, your stories. So keep writing, keep reading. We'll see you next week.